and actually the physical dialogues, and we have many more people participating virtually. And I think going forward, we might have a digital kind of a dialogue. But I think that this is a very interesting concept. We have a fantastic and a distinguished panel of speakers here to discuss the role of multilateralism in a new world. There are many debates in the world whether globalization will continue in the way that we are talking. There's been a series of challenges to multilateral organizations, beginning with the WTO and then, more recently on the WHO. But I think the panelists who are domain leaders and thought leaders in their own right, a very warm welcome to Professor Amitabh Mattu, Professor of Disarmament Studies, Center of International Politics, Organization and Disarmament in JNU. Professor Mattu, a very warm welcome to you. And, it's really good to see you again. We have actually interacted with you in many different avatars, and personally, I think you're a very warm friend. Also, to a very warm welcome to Ms. Lalita Kumara Manglam, Director, India Foundation. She also is a long-standing friend of FICCI, has participated in many of our dialogues, and I would extend a very warm welcome to you. FICCI also has a very strong partnership with the India Foundation. Ambassador Basmati Mukherjee, welcome again. I remember the dialogue last year where you actually presented, and we had then the advisor to Ms. Angela Merkel, who of course participated physically in that meeting, but as president of the Association of Indian Diplomats, you not only bring the current status, but also with your vast diplomatic experience. A very warm welcome to you. Professor Siddharth Malavarapu, Professor and Head, Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, School of Humanities, Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University. A very warm welcome to you. You have great experience in this area, and you do a lot of writing in this space. So very warm welcome, and we look forward to you. We have Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi, Professor and Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, Department of International Relations, South Asian University. Very warm welcome to you. You have 35 years of experience in research and writing, and also you were Professor of Political Science at Punjab University, Chandigarh, and have done very interesting work in the area of geopolitics and IR in different parts of the world. So thank you for joining and welcome. Dr. Chandrakant Haria, National Professor, Professional Officer, Healthcare Access and Protection, World Health Organization. Very warm welcome to you. Thank you for actually getting time to join this. I know that the WHO is really in the center of all the action that is actually happening in this space. We look forward to your comments, especially since you worked in the area of global health governance, health diplomacy, public policy, and you have been interacting with the G20 as well. Of course, moderators of today's discussion, we have Stanley Johnny, International Affairs Hindu. Of course, his book actually, The ISIS Caliphate from Syria to the Doorsteps of India, was brought out by Bloomsbury in 2018. You have contributed actually significant chapters on Indian national security and other areas. You also teach at the Asian College of Journalism, Chennai, and are a visiting scholar at Kerala University. So a very warm welcome to our distinguished panel. While the dialogues 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 examined the future of work, the gender lens to COVID, the value of sustainability in the new normal, and we looked at the future of digital connectivity, raising the bandwidth. And the 5th dialogue in the new normal series evaluated the impact of pandemic on how the world is gravitating from globalization to localization. today's dialogue will address the role of multilateralism in the new normal. And I think I would just welcome all the panelists, welcome all the participants in this dialogue, and wish that you have a great, 1 hour 45 minutes on the in this dialogue. So thank you very much for joining, and I hand it back to you. Thank you. So Shushma, will you invite or?
Mr. Rimele, if you could deliver your remarks, please.
Yes, let me do so. Thank you. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, let me also extend a very warm welcome to you to our ongoing series on the new normal. But what makes it very interesting, but also difficult to talk about this new normal is the fact that it is anything but normal. Or has the old normal become abnormal now? Well, let's avoid semantics and try to get to the topics. Around the world, lockdowns are either intensifying or easing. Infection rates rising or falling, government regulations constantly changing. The point I want to make is perhaps obvious, but I think it's one worth making. There is still no real new normal. Nobody could really know what the normal is. So when we analyze the current situation, we should always keep in mind that tomorrow there might already be an entirely different normal. So the new is changing definition every day because of the extremely pacey dynamics of change in our everyday lives. But coming to our topic of multilateralism, one element of the new normal is the fact that the corona pandemics has brought back the competition of systems, what maybe we wrongly believed to be over after the end of the Cold War. On the one side, the United States, on the other side, China, rest of the world, including India, somewhere in between and trying to find its position. What does that mean in the field of international relations, about which we will be hearing today? Please allow me to start off with some remarks about the current situation in Germany and in Europe. From the 1st of July, Germany, in person of Chancellor Merkel, will take over the presidency of the European Council. That's, for those who are not so familiar with the institutions, that's basically a collective body set up of the heads of state or governments of the member states, plus the president of the European Commission. And this body defines the European Union's overall political directions and priorities. So with the German leadership for the next half year now, there is no secret that under German presidency, the relationship after the pandemic between EU, its members, and China will be a top priority. So also Europe is trying to find its position in an increasingly bipolar world. It's no state secret that the European Union is plagued by strong internal tensions. The euro crisis, Brexit, migrant crisis, a handful of smaller tensions are dividing the continent, and now the coronavirus does its part in that too, not just in Europe, but in the whole world. Just remember Beijing's PR coup when they sent medical supplies and specialists to COVID-plagued Italy, a country that first had been left alone by its European friends and where Euroscepticism is already running rampant. So Italy is the only major Western that has signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, while Germany has passed legislation that China from taking over enterprises considered vital to national interests. Italy is actively encouraging such investments. It acts as the main gateway for the Eastern Dragon to foment disharmony in Europe. But China was able to pull off a similar stunt in Serbia too, where President Alexander Vučić angrily declaimed that European solidarity was but a fairy tale. So you see why China is also an important player in what is happening within Europe. So these incidents are having a devastating effect on the European Union's public image. But as always in politics and in history, there is not only black and white, there's also gray and many other colors in between. So it took some time for the Union to get its acts together, agree on a common line, and even on a longer one for Germany to agree. It's now called Europe's, call it Hamiltonian moment, a common recovery fund to combat the virus. So that is the current status. Germany is central to all efforts at defining the European response to the crisis. The COVID-stricken countries at the European South are expecting the rich North to show solidarity, while the North, and especially the so-called frugal four, if you heard that term that covers Austria, Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, they're looking at Germany to hold firm against such notion and point to their national sovereignty. So you see, to get the EU together and its members has different poles, and it's always a difficult process, and that will continue. So no matter which way the political pendulum will swing, it's obvious that Europe is in dire need of multilateral and supranational approach in order to be able to further compete with much stronger players in Asia and the Americas. The old nation states, to put it like that, will not have the same chance than a strong Europe. Europe has relied on these economies for their new and for their raw materials for a great part of the continent's modern history. So the current situation of disruption in international trade has forced us, like India, to re-evaluate these relations. The question is now how to restore supply chains or at least limit the vulnerability. Many countries are trying to find answers in developing their own version of what in India is called Atmanirbharta. So the European countries are also trying to think something. Analyzing how dependent a country or a region is on an economic disruption may be a good start. But such analysis will also show the limits of such in tendency protectionistic and isolationist tendencies. Economic decoupling is expensive, and the pandemic, on the other hand, leaves most countries with shrinking fiscal space. So that already sets some limits. And this is why it is really too early to declare multilateralism as a waning international force of cooperation and global good governance, and coming back to the old independent nation state idea. But we cannot deny that strong forces, even beyond the current crisis, are at work to change the fundamentals of our current world order. So that leads me back to China. We witnessed how China enforced its will in the South China Sea and gained the upper hand. So the core of Chinese engagement, wherever it appears, remains the same. Therefore, I'm of the firm belief that multilateralism will emerge stronger and more deeply entrenched than before in order to maintain, but also to upgrade the current system of world governance. Having said that, of course, it would now be very interesting to hear where India stands in this changing environment. And what I would like to see is, of course, how would India define the new normal for itself? Thank you very much.
Stanley, can you unmute yourself? Yeah. Stanley, we can't hear you. Yeah, if you can unmute yourself. Yeah, Hi, Stanley. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Thank you very much for the opening remarks. I'll just straight away go into the dialogue. So we are witnessing a global pandemic which will have far-reaching consequences on every part of our life, and it includes the international system. So our first speaker today is Professor Amitabh Mattu. Hi, Professor. Nice to see you here. And we are looking forward to listening to your observations on multilateralism.
Thank you very much, Stanley. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yeah. I do want to, first of all, thank Mr. Dilip Chinoy, Secretary General of FICCI, as well as FICCI more generally in Sukanya, and Peter Remel as the resident representative of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for organizing this extremely relevant and topical webinar. I also want to acknowledge the fact that much of what I am going to be saying is part of a collaborative paper that I wrote with Professor Amrita Narlekar. We published an op-ed in the Hindu recently, and Narlekar is the president of the German Institute of International Affairs, Global Affairs, as well as a professor at Hamburg University. Now, the topic, as Dilip pointed out, role of multilateralism in the new normal. Each one of those words could be contested. Role, multilateralism, new normal. But given the limitations of time and given that we're talking in a forum that is looking at the policy implications, let me begin by making just two major points. And I'll flesh them out, Stanley, and I understand that we should do so in 7 to 8 minutes. While the coronavirus pandemic unleashes its devastation across the globe, almost everyone, the great and the good, have been quick to remind us of the value of multilateralism and the necessity to preserve it. And yes, like Peter, I agree. They're right to reduce the further spread immediately of the virus, to develop effective medical treatments, including vaccines which are universally available, and to curtail the worst economic effects and other effects of the recession that is not just in the offing, that is there. Cooperation among nations will be needed on an urgent basis. But there is a fundamental problem. The problem is that multilateralism, when we need it most, is at its weakest today. The need for multilateralism is more dire than ever before, and yet, unless we address the fundamental problems of multilateralism, no meaningful quick fix, no magic mantra, no silver bullet is possible. The second point that I will make is that India, I believe, may be uniquely positioned to help resuscitate multilateralism. With the United States facing multiple internal challenges, including the possibility, not just the possibility, the clarity of the kind of deeply divisive presidential election in November, New Delhi, I believe, could assume leadership in strengthening constructive transnational cooperation, along with some states that I'll identify, including Germany. At a time when China, as Peter pointed out, is facing a global crisis of credibility, India could even consider a last-ditch attempt at mediation. And when I use the word mediation, I do so to suggest that India could temper what is increasingly seen as Beijing's unilateralist revisionism and revive the promise of what the liberal institutionalists described as the gradual socialization of China into the international system and its acceptance of the norms and rules that regulate the principal multilateral institutions. First point, fleshing it out, what is the crisis of multilateralism? The crisis of multilateralism is fundamentally a crisis of all the three pillars: trust, legitimacy, and leadership. All three are visible in a large number of multilateral institutions, and as someone pointed out, they're most clearly visible in the way in which the largest trading multilateral organization, the World Trade Organization, is paralyzed today, and its negotiation capabilities beyond the Doha round, its dispute settlement mechanisms, and its transparencies is one glaring example of the paralysis of the WTO. The severely dented credibility of the WHO is another indicator. Even going beyond what is described in traditional IR literature as the functionalist areas, if you go to the security regime, you begin to see the stresses and strains on the nuclear regime, particularly as the United States begins to think, even begin to think itself as a leap of faith, begins to think of retesting nuclear weapons. And China, there were reports, I don't know how accurate they were, that they actually did conduct some subcritical and other nuclear tests even while there was lockdown. The rest of the world was under lockdown. In other words, I suggest that the pandemic has heightened the crisis of multilateralism and not created it. And amidst the many cracks of the system, it has deepened one especially dangerous fault line. Multilateralism in its current form is incapable of dealing with the misuse by systemic rivals within the international system. And this goes beyond the personality, and I don't really want to focus on the personality of the Director General of the WHO, for instance, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. It goes beyond that. It is that multilateralism is incapable of preventing its misuse by systemic rivals. After all, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and FICCI will both testify to the fact that the underpinning assumption of the post-war multilateral system was that peace and prosperity went hand in hand. Some like-mindedness and commonly held purpose were also assumed among members. Increasing economic integration and shared prosperity would help enhance these affinities and contribute to peace. Countries with fundamentally different domestic systems of governance didn't form part of this multilateral order. None of our multilateral institutions was built for a world where ties of interdependence, which were supposed to enhance the well-being of all, could themselves be weaponized for nationalistic gain at the expense of the other players. The misuse of existing rules or loopholes within the existing rules by several countries, especially, and let's admit it, frankly, candidly, China, example, forced technology requirements, intellectual property rights violations, and subsidies to gain an unfair advantage of trade relations was already attracting critique in the last years. But the pandemic has provided us with some even more alarming illustrations of how damaging the weaponization of global supply chains can be. And Peter and others have already talked about how these supply chains were misused. Against this background, repeated calls by heads of government and international organizations urging countries to remain committed to multilateralism can often ring hollow. But as I said, unless we address the fundamental issues of trust, legitimacy, and leadership. First, of course, there needs to be a reassurance and renewed commitment by like-minded countries to the raison d'etre of multilateralism. Even a retreating United States must demonstrate in word and deed that autarky, protectionism is not a way forward, and that it remains committed to strengthening global supply chains, which are based on the promise of ensuring global stability and the attendant promise of peace and prosperity. Second, irrespective of whether this happens or not, there is a need for some degree of strategic decoupling, handled smartly in cooperation with other like-minded countries. This will not happen overnight, and it will undoubtedly cause considerable disruption to existing global value chains. This, in turn, will result in a shrinking of the global economic pie. We will be less prosperous, but we will also be more secure. Third, a multilateralism that recognizes the need for decoupling will necessitate closer cooperation with some and distancing in a world where social distancing is the new term. It requires some distancing from others. Membership of such renewed multilateral institutions would not be universal. Rather, one would limit deep integration to countries which share first-order values such as pluralism, democracy, liberalism, animal welfare rights, and much, much more. The current crisis of multilateralism, and that is my final point, could be a remarkable opportunity for India, a country whose pluralism, democracy, and liberalism have often and sometimes with evidence, been underestimated by the West. At the immediate level, the gains could be obvious. India has maintained a consistent reserve about a blanket entrenchment in global value chains, and some constituencies in the West are seeking to decouple from China. We could be well served to look towards India beyond the pandemic, and to make use of the opportunities for itself and for the provision of certain global public goods. India's cooperation, and this is my final point, with like-minded actors will be key. Here, India could work closely with the Alliance for Multilateralism, an initiative launched by Germany and France to shape both the alliance itself and the reform agenda at large. Working together with a group of countries from the developed and developing world could further amplify India's voice. In other words, there is a crisis of multilateralism India can resuscitate together with like-minded countries if we have a clear common strategy in place. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, Stanley, we can hear you.
Professor Mattu. I also the kind of opportunities of to India and I invite our next speaker, Lalita Kumaramangalam, Director of India.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me, first of all, because I was not able to hear Stanley too clearly. So I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. Good. First of all, good morning to everybody once again. And my thanks to Mr. Chinoy, Sukanya, and the whole team at FICCI for inviting me to be a speaker at this webinar. I am not going to stick to the tried and tested opinions or the facts on multilateralism, and I'm just going to make 3 points, which some may find a bit goes a bit against the grain, but I feel pretty strongly that there has to be some more perhaps pragmatic approach to what multilateralism is going through today. As we know, the concept itself seems to be under a lot of threat and fire, and perhaps to an extent justifiably so. But there are 3 or 4 points that are inevitably going to take place with regard to multilateralism and with special regard to India too, or India's role in it. First, we all know that in the last 30, 25 years or so, multilateralism has been based mainly on economic concerns, trade, commerce, etc. But given the fact that the COVID crisis is actually a health crisis, and many people blame the fact that the world has become perhaps a bit too globalized, which is why
Ma'am, could you adjust your camera, ma'am? We can't see you properly, ma'am.
My camera is on.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. If you could just tilt it slightly so we could see you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Perfect.
Okay now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect.
Okay, okay. All right. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. As I was saying, in order to be able to take multilateralism forward, we need to look at it more pragmatically. The first thing is that we have to understand that there has to be a change in both the ethos and the template of how multilateralism is today practiced. Today, it is based mainly on the economics, trade, commerce, business, etc. But from here onwards, we have to look at it from a more human angle. I'm not talking merely about environmental concerns, etc. But we have to understand that human-centric has got to be amongst the top priorities of any form of multilateralism that can survive or first survive and then prosper. Secondly, we have to also accept that there is going to be an inevitable change in the political scenario of the world. Whether we are going to tilt away from so-called liberalism to so-called nationalism, whether we are going to look at China with far more doubt than earlier due to many reasons that can be given and will be given, uh, whether we are looking at a realignment of nations, even from the institutional perspective of multilateralism, like the G7 into the G10, or the Quad into Quad Plus, or even Quad Plus Plus, or even ASEAN, which may be expanded to include China, Japan, etc. There is a lot on the anvil, and I don't think it will be possible for those changes to be stopped. We are going to have to accept that there is going to be a realignment of partnerships, whether economic or otherwise, politically, certainly. Let's also accept that some of the military changes that are military changes that are going to happen in the neighborhood of India, especially with the US pulling out of Afghanistan, is going to create, is going to have to make India also make a few changes in its attitude towards multilateralism. We know that India politically now is heading towards not perhaps a total change in terms of not wanting to trade with other nations, that's also been made clear. But yes, a greater emphasis on self reliance, especially with regard to supply chains. And supply chains is where globalization or multilateralism has worked its greatest success in the past. But okay, the other point also is that health and tech, I feel technology is going to be the way for moving forward. And in both these areas, India has almost an automatic advantage, especially when it comes to the non-traditional methods of health, which are looking at health not merely from the medical curative point of view, but also from the non-medical and medical preventive point of view. We are known as the pharmacy of the world. When I worked in HIV/AIDS prevention beginning from 91 onwards, I saw how it was built up with with both a great deal of effort from both private sector and organizations like FICCI and the government. Now, we already know that Oxford has approached one of our main vaccine producers to be a partner in producing vaccines cheaply for the poorer countries. And let's accept that some of that vaccine will also be used in India and will be needed in India. It's not just that. We are amongst the top suppliers of medical personnel, nurses, paramedical staff, doctors all over the world. So we also will have therefore an automatic influence on the sort of decisions that are going to be taken in the medical world in terms of health moving forwards, health for all, health for the whole world, global health, which will also impact multilateralism and globalization in terms of supply chains, in terms of many other things. Also, we need to understand, fourthly, that, and this is something that I feel pretty strongly about, that given the new, what is expected of the new post-COVID world, violence is going to have to be addressed in a very, very serious manner. Not just gender violence, but violence across the board. Whether it's discrimination in terms of religion or gender or color or any other thing, the World Bank has done some amount of research, and the losses that are faced by countries, go into billions and billions of dollars, actually trillions of dollars from what I've seen and what the data that I have gone through. Now, given that we are asking for even more transparent and, borders that one can move through, especially in terms of goods and services, health and violence, I think, which is why I said that much more human centricity than before, is going to be key to the way multilateralism even moves forward. The economics of it will always remain and should, because, well, money makes the world go round. But you see, today the crisis that has hit us is so much more about human behavior, about human knowledge, about human attitudes, about transparency with regard to not just external our operations or foreign policy, but also the way internally things happen in our country. Whatever one may say about China, it is now an economic juggernaut. But I think there is also a pushback against the way they have used their economic might to intimidate several smaller nations, most of whom are smaller than them anyway economically. And that also probably will have to change. How soon, how it will do so, all of that I think remains a big question mark. But there are things that we need to, there are some hard truths that have to be faced. But I do agree with Professor Matu when he says that India is perhaps placed in a very unique position to not only assume leadership, but also to be able to negotiate and mediate. The Indian ethos, our culture, the way we look at things is much less adversarial than perhaps many other countries, and that should stand us in good stead. Having said that, I'd also like to add just one last rider. That let us not compromise on, this is not national interest, it becomes too political to use those words, but let us also not compromise on our basic strengths. India has the youngest population in the world, and also, not ignore our basic weaknesses, one of which is the lack of technical skills that our youth have throughout the country. I am want to have often said and then been told to shut up because it's considered politically incorrect to say this, but our demographic advantage should not turn into a demographic burden. And we need, if we are to compete with whether it's Vietnam or any other country in attracting industry to India, whether they come out of China or from any other country, we need to have a far more technically qualified youth than we do at the moment. I'm not talking about education by rote, which is unfortunately what most education even today is in India. And I'm saying this specifically because I've seen the names of several principals from big schools in Delhi are attending this. So I'd like to say that, and mind you, it's not as if when you train people technically, you don't benefit from it economically, not just individually, but even the people who are doing the training and the organizations who are doing the training. So we need to train them in terms of health too. Health and hygiene is something that's, and it's very technical, the training. We just don't assume that it's technical, that's all. Health and hygiene is one of the most important technical training that we need to give our children and our youth in this country. We also need to make people understand that it's not just having money or it's not just the economics of things that is now going to be important in the future. And it's like, I think I'm, sometimes I think I'm flogging a horse that is about to give up the race, but we have to start putting each other in terms of literally just human relations also first. If humankind is to survive, we have to do it sustainably in future. And there's going to be a lot of other, not just environmental, but there's going to have to be a lot of other changes in lifestyles across the world if multilateralism is even to, work. I'll stop with that. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity, and I hope I made sense to all of you.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, madam. Ambassador Baswari Mukherjee is unfortunately, she couldn't join us for some issues. So we will move to Professor Siddharth Mallavarappu of Shivnadar University. Siddharth, please share your thoughts with us.
Okay, a very good morning to. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. To all of you. At the outset, I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the hosts of this particular event, Fiki and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for having invited me here to share my thoughts in this virtual webinar. Let me begin with just a few prefatory remarks, broad prefatory remarks on multilateralism, and then go on to addressing, I think, things, 6 dimensions you mentioned, which I distilled from your keynote. And I'll try to sort of keep this brief because I am aware of the fact that we need to sort of finish this in 5 to 8 minutes. So first, the broad remarks around multilateralism. To begin with, I think we need to think historically about multilateralism, which means that we need to cast a long view on multilateralism. The reason why I say it is because sometimes in particular moments of political crisis, there is a tendency sometimes to be focused very much on a particular moment in time and to miss the broader picture, which in a sense is important when one thinks about the histories of multilateralism. It goes back, of course, to the 19th century, starting way back to the International Telegraphic Union in 1865, and subsequently, of course, you have the Latin Monetary Union, the League of Nations, United Nations, a whole range of other developments around it. I think it's interesting to think about the historical context in which multilateralism arose, and it might be useful to think about this in order to also explain partially the crisis we are faced with now. Because these institutions, even institutions like the United Nations, were created at a particular moment in time. In the mid-40s, and we've moved considerably from there, and the world naturally, of course, witnessed a whole range of changes. Sometimes institutions do not necessarily keep up with these changes, and a whole range of issues, whether it relates to membership, representation, legitimacy questions, trust deficits. I think all of these are, in a sense, viewed in the backdrop of these changes. Second, I think we need to recognize that multilateralism is of different kinds, that there are different species of multilateralism. And here I would sort of make a mention of at least two broad kinds. One, of course, is regional multilateralism, and the other is global multilateralism. And here, if you follow the work of scholars like David Malone or Rohinton Medhora in a recent piece, argue that this distinction is often forgotten when it comes to discussions around multilateralism. So I think one of the important things to sort of think about while thinking about the question of multilateralism is to see that regional multilateralism in some forms may be still alive and kicking, while the real crisis seems to be much more linked to our understanding of global multilateralism. And here, when we're thinking about regional multilateralism, there are two or three clear instances where there seems to be some work going on, whether it's with regard to the European Union or even with regard to the Asean. For instance, with the European Union, I think Professor Mattu mentioned the Alliance for Multilateralism. And I think in 2018, you had the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas arguing that we need to think about the role of, for instance, thinking about even the COVID-19 crisis, to think about immunization as quote unquote as a global public good. And the need, therefore, to affirm the role of a legal or a law-based international order, as well as a need for an informal alliance, which generally is supportive of the idea of multilateralism. Again, coming to the ASEAN region, I think with Vietnam in the chair this year in 2020, we did witness a fair amount of intra-ASEAN as well as dialogues with the ASEAN partners when it came to the COVID-19 crisis. And here again, I think what you witness is attempts to revive some forms of active regional multilateralism when it comes to addressing global health crises like the COVID-19. I know that we're also aware that in the SARC context, there was a COVID-19 emergency fund created where countries pledged some resources to this. But I think there is also an interest at some level of thinking about more long-term solutions to these crises. COVID-19 is a current crisis, but I don't think it's going to exhaust what we are going to see in the future. We may be faced with many similar crises, and what we need, therefore, is a set of mechanisms which will address this over time. Third, I think there is interesting work which brings to bear some conceptual innovations around the notion of multilateralism. And here I would just want to insert this category called contested multilateralism. There's a recent piece by Julia Morse and Robert Cohen, which basically argues that contested multilateralism, quote, involves the use of different multilateral institutions to challenge the rules, practices, or missions of existing multilateral institutions. And what we're witnessing in some sense is likely to be greater contested multilateralism. And they, in a sense, allude to two strategies here. One, of course, is a strategy which they refer to as regime shifting, where the attempt is to increase the policy space and the room for maneuver within these institutional setup, which we already have. And the other is what is referred to as competitive regime creation, where there's an attempt sometimes to create new institutions which challenge or which seek to challenge in some ways the status quo. So here again, there are illustrations of both these phenomena. In the first case, I think there was interest in terms of thinking about how the World Bank has been inserted into questions of global health governance. And in the latter case, what you witness is, for instance, the example of the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, in a sense, contesting some of the earlier ground of the International Energy Agency, which didn't focus so much, they argued, on renewables and questions relating to renewables. Okay, this brings me now to my more specific set of claims. I think there are 6 themes which I distilled from your own keynote, from your own backgrounder, which you shared with us. The first point, I think, related to the question of populism and whether to think about how populism generally relates to the question of multilateralism. I think this is an interesting political question to think about at some level, because while thinking about populism at one plane, the pressures sometimes are to be more inward looking. And the pressures sometimes are to therefore be less receptive to the possibilities of some forms of multilateral engagement. But while thinking about this question of populism in general, one could argue that populism, if one were to sort of just posit a possible hypothesis, you could argue that populism does not augur well for multilateralism. And if you think about the global zeitgeist in some sense, the spirit of the age, if one were to argue, one of the obstacles, I think, in some sense, to thinking about multilateralism and other ways of engaging with multilateral institutions may have to do also with challenges faced internally in many countries around the world. So that's something to bear in mind. The second issue, I think, relates to what you called as global geopolitics. And here again, what we are seeing is, I think, a point made by my previous speakers fairly clearly about a fluid world and a changing world. You, for instance, now see arguments increasingly surfacing about what is being referred to as a new Cold War, the rivalry between the major powers, between the United States and China. So some would argue, for instance, that what we're witnessing is, in a sense, the tension between a status quoist power, which is the United States, and a revisionist power, which is China. And while it's not very clear how exactly this will pan out, there are clearly apprehensions about what implications this may have for our understanding of multilateralism in general. And quite clearly, you can see that some of these fault lines have been accentuated by the current COVID-19 crisis. But my argument here is that the new Cold War setting might also, in a strange way, create openings for contested multilateralism. And I would even hazard a guess here that it would be contested multilateralism potentially of the competitive regime creation variant, which means that it may no longer just be about tinkering with existing institutions, but it might be, there may be a push towards creating alternatives to the existing institutions. And that's something I think one needs to be, watchful of. Third, I think, while thinking about the role of non-state actors in multilateralism, I think many scholars have noted that, when you think about the UN and the UN Charter, that it begins with "we the peoples of the United Nations." So where do peoples figure in this narrative on multilateralism? And I think quite clearly, even if you look at multilateral treaty negotiation processes over the last several years, what you see is that increasingly NGOs, non-governmental actors, non-state actors, in a sense, get more voice and representation in these forums. So one could argue here at some plane that one of the incentives perhaps to multilateralism may actually come from a democratic deepening, which could strengthen multilateralism. It's a recognition or acknowledgement at some level that global problems require global solutions, and this might necessitate a degree of international cooperation. This brings me to the fourth facet, which relates to science and multilateralism. And I would treat science here more generally as a broader knowledge system. So while thinking about even addressing the current crisis, quite clearly, it would make a lot of sense for the best minds in the world to get together to address this problem and to create a solution for this problem. And if you go back to early histories of multilateralism, again, I think there's really fine work by Madeline Herron here, which looks at, for the period between 1860 to 1945. And she points to, for instance, a conference called the Geodetic conference, which took place as early as 1864 on land surveying, which brought together people from very many different countries. So what you witness, even during the Cold War years, one could argue that there were instances in which there was a degree of scientific cooperation necessitated sometimes by particular crises. So here again, one argument one could make about multilateralism is that epistemic cooperation or some degree of knowledge-based transfers, knowledge-based possibilities of linkages and networks might actually be good news for multilateralism. Because I think there will be, given the recognition that it's no longer possible sometimes to solve problems purely from one particular context, that it's important to share information about, even with regard to, for instance, the nature of this virus and how it seems to be operating in some respects differently in different contexts. That information may be necessary for a vaccine, which might eliminate it. So again, here I think there's again possible scope of thinking about multilateralism through the realms of collaboration in science, collaboration through actors, epistemic communities, and knowledge-based communities. Fourth, I think with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda. Here again, I think, looking back at the list of the Sustainable Development Goals, think about poverty, hunger, global health and well-being, gender equality. Many of these goals will not be realized unless there is a certain degree of coordination of responses. I think our preceding speakers very rightly mentioned that one of the big challenges we're going to are faced with is global inequality. And if we are to address global inequality in meaningful ways, there is no other way but to get together. So one of the SDGs also, states explicitly that we need to build partnerships for goals. How are these partnerships going to be built in the absence of some degree of coordination of responses, some degree of empathy in terms of how these questions can be addressed? So I would make a claim that the SDGs also cannot be realized at some plane without a recognition of some forms of cooperative multilateralism. Sixth, I think there are governance dilemmas, which we talked about. I think one of the challenges really we're faced with is this whole question of inclusive governance. How can we have more inclusive governance structures globally? There are clearly democratic deficits. There are clearly issues with regard to the provision of global public goods, whether it's clean air or clean water. There is also the question of the avoidance of global public bads. In this case, quite clearly, the current global crisis, health crisis, also tells us that the virus itself, in some sense, has worked as a global public bad because it's disrupted so much of the world's supply chains, the world's economy, livelihoods of people. So here again, I would argue that the crisis is indeed an opportunity. And I agree with the previous speakers that India is very well positioned and well placed to make a critical use of this particular moment, I think, to offer some leadership when it comes to questions relating to, first of all, international organizations and ensuring greater weight and representation, a greater equity in the manner in which these institutions are run. And secondly, also in terms of, I think, coordinating a set of responses, creating coalitions, which might, in a sense, strengthen our own leverage, both in terms of ideas we can offer, as well as in terms of building on existing partnerships which have preceded this particular moment in time. I think there's a fine piece by Peter Manzo in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which is titled "A Crisis is a Terrible Thing to Waste." And this really comes from the Nobel laureate Paul Michael Romer, who said this some years ago when he said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. I think we should actually see the crisis as an opportunity indeed. And there may be a possibility to really, it may create openings, some of which will be contested multilateralism. But I think the idea of multilateralism is not going away because we really have no choice as I see it. Thank you.
About different of multilateralism. thought on multilateralism. Welcome, Professor.
Professor Chaturvedi, Stanley has just invited you to speak here.
The connection for a moment. Well, thank you very much. I feel so privileged and honored to have this invitation. Very grateful to Vicky and Conrad Adenauer Foundation. Being late on the list of speakers has its very obvious strategic advantages. And one such advantage is that I have gathered so many insights that I can now use them to add a few footnotes and further build up on some of those arguments. In fact, the statement that Professor Siddharth, the quotation that he offered us, was a quotation which was on the very first page of my notes, because I fully agree with this particular insight that every crisis is a potential laboratory, social science laboratory, to rethink, revisit the so-called mainstream understandings of international relations and geopolitics. And I think this applies to all disciplines and the whole set of practices. My starting point is that what Professor Amitabh Mattu said, that these terms are inherently contested or fundamentally contested. I quite agree with that statement, but I also feel that what adds to the contestation is also the context. Concepts travel, theories proliferate in all their forms and manifestations. But when they are faced with a context, we find that there is a crisis in terms of description, explanation, and even the so-called prediction. Now, COVID-19 has emerged before us. Not a surprise, because we had in 2012 a fascinating book called Spillovers, which was talking about a trend which was unfolding. So it's not that here comes a great surprise from nowhere. I'll come to that point a little later, particularly towards the end of my presentation. But what needs to be appreciated is, as we talk about multilateralism, its various sites and forms and agendas, that it has come at a moment when we were discussing climate change in the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. The last meeting that I attended was in Durban. And that process has been delayed. It has also come at the moment of what is called the Anthropocene. It has also come at a moment when many of us interested in maritime affairs and maritime domains were talking about the blue economy. So this crisis has come on the intersections and crossroads. And I think that really compels us to really rethink the very notion of multilateralism. Now, I would also like to raise another question at the very outset, and which is that when and how do the pandemics end? It's a very important question, because if we are talking about the new normal, how close or far is that new normal is? Well, there is a scientific explanation as to when pandemics end, but there is also a social and political explanation as to when they end. Social ending always takes longer, which means that socially speaking, politically speaking, the new normal perhaps is not as close as many of us would wish it to be. And that social ending comes when we get rid of the fear, when it is not just the virus that gets out of our physical system, but it is the fear and anxieties and mistrusts which get out of our mental maps, get out of our thinking and our social relationships. So that is one point which I wanted to make. So my argument then becomes that rather than waiting for the new normal to arrive, and it can be very complex, it will have a very complex geography to it. Depending upon the locations, the same new normal will look very differently from diversity of locations, diversity of agendas, diversities of multilateralism that are going on. We should focus on the trends. I think trend analysis at this stage is critically important. And if we look at the trends, then what do we see? First of all, let me talk about some of the silences of multilateralism. Let me draw attention to what I can call subliminal multilateralisms. They are subliminal, but they are very central to the narrative that we are all addressing, which is the narrative of health. It is not just the individual health, the health of the humans, but we are looking at the planetary health. And that is, Professor Siddharth did make a reference to that when he talked about the public common goods, the global commons. Now, why global commons are important and why trend analysis with regard to global commons is important, let me explain by giving you an example. As and when the moment of new normal comes, we would all be looking at a recovery. Now, this would be economic recovery. This would be recovery of certain norms and values which we might have lost on the way. This would be a recovery of humanism. This would be a recovery of humane governance. This would be a recovery in the form of realization that we need to move from domination to non-domination as the fundamental principle of governance in the context of various multilateralisms. So the point that I want to make is that these trends are very important. Now, what are these trends? Let me talk very quickly about some of these trends, and then I'll come to what role can India possibly play. One is that, as I was saying, that when we talk about recovery, 80% of the planet, which is the oceans, is going to be the site to watch. Now, between now and the new normal, as I said earlier, a lot of damage has already been done to ecosystems. Oceans are already in red. We are having that fear that we are going to see probably more plastic in the ocean rather than fish in the ocean. Now, lot of economic recovery, when it comes to economic recovery in the post COVID-19 order or disorder, whatever we call it, blue economy narrative is going to be very, very important. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of this argument, but I thought that this particular aspect has to be brought into play along with the other global commons. Say, for example, the governance of the high seas. We know that the negotiations that are going on in the United Nations, the Law of the Sea Convention on the preservation of biodiversity in the high seas, has also been badly hit. It is not simply a question of disruption of governance, but it is also a question of the vast ecological damage that continues to unfold. For example, as a result of COVID-19, we are likely to see a rise in IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. There is only one continent on the planet, which is Antarctica, where we have not seen even a single case, fortunately, of COVID-19, 5.5 million square miles of continent. But we did see 2 months back a very serious crisis when a ship, tourist ship, called Greg Mortimer, had to be sent back because they had a very large number of COVID-19 cases, more than 60. And the kind of nightmare they went through is also worth taking into account. So my point is, high seas, Antarctica, ocean space, the whole question of multilateralism has to be seen very, very closely with a critical eye. The second is that we find, and this is a point which I want to make, keeping well in mind the fact that the next speaker is from the World Health Organization. And that is that I do see a trend towards what some scholars have called the geopolitics of disease. Now, as health-related issues are getting securitized and nationalized, I wonder, as and when the new normal arrives, what would be happening to the Indo-Pacific Alliance? What would be happening to Quad, for example? What would be happening to China's Belt and Road? Because one thing is very clear, that the developments that are unfolding in front of our eyes have forced us to critically rethink the very concept of connectivity. There was a time during the Cold War when connection defined danger. Then we entered into a moment when disconnection seemed to be defining danger. And now connection and mobility, these two concepts are becoming increasingly complex and compelling, and they are becoming very contested. So what can India do? Where can India contribute? Now, first and foremost, I have always believed that when we mention Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we forget this particular rendering, this wisdom, is about looking at the human and the non-human world together. Now, new multilateralism in the new normal cannot afford to be human-centric. Human and the non-human world will have to be taken together. It is also a wake-up call for all those who followed and who praised uncritically economic growth-oriented model of development driven by carboniferous capitalism and calling it development. So this would also be a moment to rethink development and realize that multilateralisms are not ends in themselves or by themselves. Multilateralisms are means to realize certain objectives, to realize certain norms, and therefore India can play and should play a very central role in the norm making. Similarly, I think India should resist all the trends that tend to securitize the health issues. It is quite possible that this will, in fact, it has become a matter of tug of war of a sort as a geopolitical disease. And attention is diverted from a very vital sector of health, which falls in what we call in IR the low politics. So India can make a contribution there. India can and should also make a contribution in terms of the scale, the question of scale in multilateralism. I think the multilateralism of the 21st century, COVID-19, of course, there will be global multilateralisms, high seas, Antarctica, so on. There would be regional multilateralisms, Indian Ocean Rim Association, but there would also be sub-regional initiatives to address the challenge, the kind of challenges that we are all facing. For example, BIMSTEC, rejuvenating SAARC. These would be the challenges, I think, where India can and should play a very important role, along with what I said, making a contribution in terms of the eco-philosophy of the new multilateralism, which lies in the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam idea. So thank you very much. I'll stop at this and join the conversation later. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, again, I mean, almost crisis. As Professor Chaturvedi said, every crisis is a potential laboratory for further solutions, and all of India is here, or India can play a central role in addressing this crisis and going forward. So next, I'd like to invite Professor Haria of WHO. Take the stage, sir.
Thank you very much, everyone, my co-panelists, and a very good afternoon. I'm not professor, but thank you very much for saying that. When we think of multilateralism and its evolution in new normal of COVID-19, as some of the earlier speakers said, that we need to look back to look ahead. The context remains the same, multilateralism, but my interventions will focus on health specifically. I come from World Health Organization and I work in health, so I'll focus on health aspects. What I've done, in interest of time, I have structured my intervention in three parts. One how multilateralism was functioning for health before coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic. And then second part, how COVID-19 had changed or changing the scenario. And finally, I'll reflect what next. If we look back, for health, there has been a few multilateral mechanisms and collaborations and coordinated actions. And each of these mechanisms had their own mandate. For example, World Health Organization had the World Health Assemblies, which are attended by the health ministers of all member states. So these assemblies meet every year and they take various decisions according to their capacity and the mandate. So that's for the place where health ministers of all countries come together and deliberate global health challenge. Then there is a UN General Assembly, which meets every year in September. And the heads of the states or foreign ministers attend these General Assembly, as we know. However, in the last 2 decades, there have been a few special sessions on various aspects of health. But UN General Assembly, as we know, is very broad-based. Health is sometimes one agenda. They discuss once upon a time about HIV/AIDS, then the tuberculosis, the emerging burden on non-communicable diseases were discussed. And more recently, last year in September, there was a special session of UN General Assembly on universal health coverage, where Indian Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi also joined and spoke. The point is that the forum of WHO is for health minister and then UN General Assembly for head of state. But what happens when UN General Assembly discuss any health issue? That it moves from ambit of health ministers to the ambit of heads of the states or even higher level, and that's important mechanism. In context of UN General Assembly, what we know that the global discourse or dialogue on sustainable development goal comes from UN and SDGs are agreed by all member states. So it definitely broadens the agenda. Health is part of that agenda, and it brings institutional mechanism or intersectoral collaboration for multilateralism. So there are mechanisms, of course. And in addition, lately G7 started discussing about health issues. G20 lately was focusing a lot on universal health coverage, antimicrobial resistance. So the mechanisms are continuously improving and increasing. The question is whether these are enough or have they done enough. Of course, that requires a detailed analysis and possibly some other time. However, the reality is that in most countries, the health remain low in the development agenda, or rather very low on development agenda or policy discourse. And if it remains low within the countries, even in the multilateral platforms, it is rarely discussed. What pandemic of COVID-19 has done, it has simply given an amplified version of the existing health challenges. And what we have come to realize that health challenge of any one setting is a challenge for the entire world. 3 months or not 3 months, now 6 months ago, nobody was talking about health. And now we are in the mid of the pandemic. And it started from one part of the world and it has affected all parts of the world. Now, what is happening? Every head of the state and senior policymaker is talking about health. Health is a major part of the discussion. Before COVID-19 pandemic, health was argued in academic circles. Now sufficient attention to the health and is being discussed. Second part, how health is changing the scenario. It is changing the scenario that what we have realized that weak health system and poor public and government health facilities is a challenge in majority of the country and country like India. What we have learned that there is insufficient government funding for health and disease surveillance. The world never paid attention to the proven and effective interventions such as vaccines. Now the entire world is talking about coronavirus, one vaccine, this coronavirus vaccine. And traditionally, the countries have underinvested in the vaccines and research and development of vaccines. More importantly, we know some of the public health interventions such as hand washing and cough etiquettes for nearly 2 centuries, but they have been underutilized. Now, this is not only in the context of coronavirus pandemic. Hand washing is such a proven intervention that it can prevent thousands of child deaths from diarrhea. Cough etiquettes can help in reducing the burden of tuberculosis. So these are the proven interventions. So the new normal in COVID-19 demand that every country need to do more on health. It need to scale up the public health intervention. It need to learn from each other. The institutions in those setups work together and deliver better health services. So this definitely require multilateralism and working together. Where does it need collaboration between countries and strengthening of institutions? We need to invest on research and development. If a vaccine is developed in one country, there is a global consensus that it should be made available for all other countries. So that is what people need to work together to find a common vaccine or a vaccine which will be available for everybody, and that requires collaboration. Some of the multilateral collaborations are already happening. The solidarity trial, which is about few medicines and drugs, hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, and this is happening in multiple countries and coordinated by WHO. It cannot be possible if countries are not collaborating. We have heard from previous speakers about the need for a global healthcare supply chain, medicines, vaccines, PPE. If one country is producing, it's a moral responsibility and social obligation and a true spirit of collaboration that it should be available to other countries. We need to learn about health system strengthening, that how one country can do better and similar setup and this thing. So there are many learnings has come up, but this is not a COVID-19 specific issue. Much before COVID-19, we know that there are limited number of antibiotics which are available. New ones are not coming, but due to indiscriminate use of antibiotics in one country or one setup, the other countries are also developing antimicrobial resistance. And this was an issue which is already a global and multicultural issue. My previous speaker talked about one health issue. Human and animal need to be seen as a one single unit, human-animal health, and that's how it will work. So final part of my intervention is that how we can make things happen in post-COVID period, whenever it will happen or it's ongoing possible. Possibly we need to, or not possibly, definitely we need to focus on strengthening the existing institutions. They need to be strengthened and empowered. Some can argue that we need more, but definitely the existing one need to be strengthened. At the beginning of this pandemic in March 2020, Honorable Prime Minister of India called a video conference of a SARC member countries, and that's the kind of collaboration are required. Early this month, Global Vaccine Summit was held in United Kingdom and attended by nearly 50 countries through virtual medium, including Prime Minister of India. So those kind of collaborations are needed. The German government hosts the World Health Summit every year. In 2018, in that summit, the participant agreed and the German Chancellor suggested that a global action plan on health and well-being be prepared, which was prepared and led by WHO. So those are the kind of institutional mechanisms are required, but we need to go beyond these mechanisms. The World Economic Forum and other such fora should be increasingly discuss about these health issues and how to make the world a healthier, safer place. And the diplomatic channel and other platforms should be used. So my final point is that pandemic would be contained and controlled soon, but learning should be used for the action. And one emerging opportunity which is coming to India as in year 2022, at 75th year of independence, India is likely to or is expected to assume the G20 presidency. I believe that that would be a great opportunity for India to show its leadership in health, transform health systems within the country, but also strengthen the multi-sectoral collaboration or multilateralism for better health for all. And that would help in achieving the globally agreed goal of universal health coverage as committed by global target of Sustainable Development Goal 3.8. Thank you very much.
Coming up the health angle of this crisis. Of course, as he said, the health crisis in one part of the world.
Is there a question for me?
I'll start the dialogue. I'll start the dialogue with a couple of questions to our speakers. First of all, Professor, Professor, one question is that you talked the crisis in multilateralism and also about the geopolitical aspect of it. So if you look at the global system now, there are conversations, there are dialogues, as you yourself mentioned, of a new Cold War between China and the United States. And how do you look at, the role India would be playing going forward? Because as a champion of multilateralism, India also has very close ties to the United States, and the Chinese are our neighbors. So what specific role you expect India to play in an evolving global system, which is also being impacted by, the pandemic, which is a once in a century thing, which will of course have its implications on the global system. And I'll also ask one question to Professor Siddharth. Professor Siddharth, you said that regional multilateralism is alive and kicking, but global multilateralism is facing headwinds. So in that context, how do you look at the crisis within regional groupings such as EU or SAARC? How do you specify these challenges? And Dr. Laharia, my last question is, Dr. Laharia, simply put, how do you look at India's fight against COVID? We are now one of the 5 most affected countries, and we still haven't peaked according to many assessments. So how do you look at it? Thank you very much.
Stanley, I think you have made a very, very important point, and the question that you asked about the new Cold War and the role that India can play. Now, traditional would suggest that India will no longer be able to hedge. Would we have to choose between the United States and China, and that we have chosen the United States? I'm one of those who begs to differ, because I think that there is strategic space to carve out, particularly in the post-pandemic world, a degree of autonomy whereby you can be a mediator in terms of ensuring that the old multilateral order doesn't entirely collapse, as well as facilitating new forms of collaboration, cooperation, institutionalization, particularly in what were traditionally called the soft areas. The premise of those who were reading or trying to understand China was based on the fact that China, before it started weaponizing multilateralism, that China was gradually being socialized into the international system, and that it was willing to accept the rules of the international system, unlike great powers of the past who wouldn't be willing to accept rules which have been created and set up by other great powers. And once it's emerged as a great power, it wants to have rules which will advance its interests. I think the point that China declared its arrival in a manner which has been so disruptive and subversive will make China hopefully introspect, and India can facilitate a recognition that China today, unlike great powers of the past, faces a crisis of credibility, legitimacy, in which it will become impossible for China to play a dominant role in the international order unless it accepts some basic minimum norms. So I think India can facilitate a mediation between the West and China, between the rest and China. Secondly, in terms of multilateralism, you've heard already in terms of the possibility of a strategic decoupling where India can act as a potential insurance policy in terms of supply chains. It has certainly the capacities to do so. There are transaction costs of people moving from China to India, and China is proving to be more resilient in terms of its economy than many other countries. So that is a huge challenge. Thirdly, even ultimately, I'm one of those who believes that beyond the theoretical paradigms of how you look at international relations, we have to focus on the welfare of people. The pandemic, and you quite are encouraged by academics to take a telescopic view of the world, but we have to, at this time when each one of us is fighting a individual and a collective battle for survival, the pandemic offers an opportunity for India to become the manufacturer uh, of a vaccine which might be developed through solidarity and other mechanisms, whether it's in Oxford or whether it's in Australia or elsewhere. India, the Serum Institute, the CIPLA laboratories have traditionally provided cost-effective solutions which have aided in the access of, which have ensured that even the poorest people have access. So universal access to a vaccine, a low-cost vaccine, could be one instrument through which India will redefine multilateralism. In an age when you have to recognize that Westphalia is we're much beyond Westphalia in many ways. So I hope that answers your question. China poses a huge belligerent threat, but it has to probably recognize, even with the narcissistic view that Xi Jinping often has of himself, that it has lost the credibility and the legitimacy, which is extremely important in the kind of world that we inhabit today. Thank you.
Stanley, should I go ahead? Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. I think when it comes to regional multilateralism, again, it's interesting to look at specific configurations of regional multilateralism. I think in the context of the EU, EU generally speaking, I think normatively has been well disposed towards forms of multilateralism. If you look at the EU, you can quite clearly see that there's a dense legal institutionalism, which is a characteristic feature of the EU. And it's interesting to see that traditional rivals like France and Germany overcame these rivalries and were able to sort of eventually be part of the same European Union. And it's a fairly audacious experiment in terms of regional multilateralism, I would think. And therefore, I think normatively speaking, EU already has the background to be well disposed towards forms of multilateralism. In the context of SARC, I think what we see in both these cases is that first there is, when a crisis of this nature breaks out, the initial response is panic. And that seems to be, something which seems to be universal around the world, where the first reaction really is to take care of your own immediate interests. And it's to a certain extent, it's a natural political reflex because you worried that, you need to first of all ensure that your own citizenry is taken care in these situations, that there is clearly sufficient resources to address the crisis as best as is possible under the current circumstances. So I think one witnessed all of this even around the COVID-19 crisis, but I have a feeling that it's not going to stop with this, people are also interested in what is likely to happen in the medium term. Quite clearly with this current crisis, there are going to be a whole range of implications, right from the social to the economic to the psychological, as some have already noted. And here again, I think what will be important here is to also think about the kinds of solutions one can think in regard to these particular problems which are faced across humanity. I don't think it's again confined to only one particular region. So even in the case of SARC, I think while they are clearly we witnessed clearly some issues and problems in terms of the manner in which we haven't successfully accomplished whatever we would have liked to have accomplished in the context of SARC. But I think even here, as Professor Chaturvedi pointed out, this is a moment perhaps for a critical pause and to sort of get back and relook at ways in which we can make the most of this. So again, here if you think of politics as the art of the possible, I think there are openings again, which will allow for. I mean, there is a possibility here when everybody recognizes that there's something, there is a public good involved, which cannot now be entirely addressed by only one country alone. Therefore, there is need for some degree of coordination around this. So I think in the context of both the EU and the SAARC, what you will witness at some levels as you go ahead will be a certain recognition and following from that recognition, an attempt to see how best one can handle this even within specific regional contexts. And India, I think, considering that it has an aspiration to play a larger role in world politics, a larger footprint in world politics, again here I think is better placed in many respects within the SAARC region to still sort of, take a certain leadership role in terms of how best this can be accomplished. So I think in the context of ASEAN, again, it's interesting that ASEAN quite clearly is very often, touted as a fairly successful experiment, particularly in certain issue areas, quite clearly. But even ASEAN is reaching out to other players, to dialogue partners, quite immediately beyond this particular immediate ASEAN context. And you do see there again that there has been fairly hectic parleying and coordination around the COVID-19 crisis. So when thinking of the dialogue partners, you're thinking of China, Japan, and South Korea. But I think more importantly, what you're witnessing is an attempt in all of these settings to build coalitions around this particular crisis and to see how best they can address it within their own regional context successfully. There is often a debate very often whether regional multilateralism is at odds with global multilateralism, whether regional multilateralism undercuts global multilateralism, or whether regional multilateralism can in some respects be complementary to global multilateralism. I would think that with the passage of time, we could perhaps see the possibility of regional multilateralisms, in a sense, providing a more complementary role to broader global arrangements with regard to these questions as well. And sometimes the solutions will come from specific regions, will come from specific contexts within regions, and then these ideas begin to catch or get resonance outside of these regional contexts. So I think we need to be prepared and willing to be a little patient with the manner in which regional multilateralism unfolds. And from there on, also see if we begin to sort of piece together elements which the current crisis of global multilateralism recognizes as important to rehabilitate. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So, to answer the question whether how India is responding to this, I think we need to understand the context. And the context is that something like this, a pandemic is happening after 100 years. And no country is prepared for this kind of scenario. And this is a novel virus. So what we know that nearly all countries struggle to contain the pandemic. They're still struggling, except for a few examples of Vietnam and South Korea, and some places, Indian state of Kerala is also being argued as a good example of this thing. However, when we examine how countries are performing, we need to look at two contexts. One, how well functioning their existing health systems are, and they can do as much as their existing systems are. And then second dimension, which we need to look when examining such scenario, is that how effectively they scaled up the intervention required to contain the pandemic. And I guess in India, those things, we know that we have a weak health system, but still the interventions done and multi-sectoral collaboration done has produced some results. But if we would look at a different approach to the pandemic, it requires interventions from three levels. Like we can categorize into three levels. One is a government and leadership and stewardship. Second is a health sector or technical experts. And third is pandemic require people to participate in the process. And if we examine from all these three dimensions, like one dimension, if government takes some action, that would not be enough unless you step up for health sector. And health sector intervention would not be enough unless people are willing to involve in that, because we know this pandemic is being contained by the non-pharmacological interventions. So only 5% of the people, or even less than 5% people require healthcare services. 80% of the people are asymptomatic and can be healthier at home. So not only now, but in the time ahead also, the success and how quickly or in what duration the pandemic will be controlled, contained, will be dependent upon all these three working together. Another thing is that in these pandemics, you or all of us keep learning from what is evolving and what we are realizing. Whether hydroxychloroquine is effective or not, you need to go by the available information. How population are getting affected. So learnings, research, expert engagement, political intervention, people participation, all will contribute to the process. And to finally summarize, pandemic is there and it will be one day, it will be over. That's a given thing. However, what is more important, that the lessons and challenges from this pandemic are not forgotten. If we stop once pandemic is contained, that will be an even bigger failure. From learning from that, the health system in India should be strengthened. And in context of multilateralism, I would repeat that India should show leadership to the world that we had a pandemic and we utilize that as an opportunity to strengthen Indian healthcare system.
Dr. Mallika Joseph, Policy Advisor, Global Partnership for Prevention of. Dr. Joseph, please ask your question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
So as a student of international organization and institutions, my comments are based on critically looking at multilateral institutions, and some of it actually were brought out by Siddharth as well as Professor Matu itself. But I just wanted to add on a few more points to the discussion. When we are talking about the crisis in multilateralism, we need to take into account some of the operational behavior of the institutions themselves. The first thing is the last 75 years, multilateral institutions have only reinforced traditional structures rather than challenge the norms and provide space for multilateralism. So I think that's a fundamental issue that needs to be looked at. And they've also become exclusive clubs dealing with only the executive branches of the government, not even the whole of the government, much less all of society or people. So that is also problematic in this current age. They have therefore squandered away the opportunity to shape new narratives infused with human security and inclusivity. How do you do this when they don't even engage with the stakeholders who are relevant to this discussion? Siddharth did mention that in disarmament, you do have a lot of NGO presence, but the final buck stops with member states, and there is no discussion within countries beyond this. And additionally, very little cooperation, much less collaboration exists between various multilateral institutions. For instance, it's taken the UN and the World Bank 75 years to come together to produce their first joint report, Pathways for Peace, which makes an argument for investing in conflict prevention. And even within the institutions, they tend to work in silos. For instance, there is much less coordination between the humanitarian and peace building agencies within the same institutions. And further, Siddharth also mentioned about this, there is no strategic engagement between multilateral institutions and regional intergovernmental organizations. For instance, which could have strengthened regional governance architectures while also creating and establishing multilateral spheres of influence. So these are the big misses which multilateral institutions have done the last decades. While we're critically looking at multilateralism today, it would be worthwhile to look at how these multilateral institutions work and how this needs to undergo fundamental and urgent change. Because for the average citizen today, the presence of multilateral institutions has not contributed in any way to his well-being. At the end of the day, it is his flawed, overstretched, and challenged local government, which is providing whatever limited relief that is coming his way in this pandemic. So I think when we need to have a reality check about when we're talking about multilateralism, and Siddharth also mentioned about we the people, I mean, it is for the people, but where is it interacting directly with the people when it is limited only to the executive branches of the government? Thank you. That's what I want to say.
Hello.
Yeah, Stanley, we can hear you.
Comment on it, or we should take.
Professor Malappu, can you unmute? We can't hear you. Your microphone is muted.
And my video doesn't seem to be. I'm unmuted.
Yeah, yeah.
And can you see me as well?
Sir, we can't see you.
Can you see me now?
Yes, sir, we can see you now.
Did you want me to say something, or Stanley? I think you should probably. I mean, Malika has made very important points, and I think what she has said needs to be reflected upon. Particularly, Mr. Laharia could, Dr. Laharia, if he could reflect on the way in which stakeholders seem to have a great lack of faith in the way in which the WHO has, the leadership has acted, and the manner in which the responses have been knee-jerk and ad hoc. I mean, I have myself witnessed how WHO has announced something one day and changed it the other day, next day. Now, I agree, no one knows anything about COVID or didn't, and that we were only second guessing most of the time. But certainly, an organization as powerful, as universal, as important as WHO should reflect, or as they say in the Indian bureaucracy, apply its mind before it actually delivers judgment. For instance, there was a press conference in which one of the chief scientists said that the asymptomatic patients are not do not pose a risk in terms of infection. That advice was overturned the next day. Initially, the ban on travel to China, from China was seen as not being necessary to prevent the spread of infection. If WHO had actually issued an advisory right in the beginning, we might not have witnessed the same intensity and scale of this global pandemic. So this is one example of how stakeholders have been let down by the WHO. And since I'm not in government and I'm an academic, I don't have to say this with any degree of diplomatic finesse, but pure candor.
Is that a question for me?
If you want to respond.
No. Okay, thank you. So, this is my personal opinion, but official. This is not an official response to WHO, but I would like to clarify a few things. One, there has been a discussion in media that travel ban. But what is globally not known that WHO does not have a mandate of putting the travel ban. It can give some advisory, but in the history of WHO's work and as part of international health regulation, WHO has never say or never is given that authority to put travel ban. So that those are the discussions which keep happening, but these are for some other time. There is another point which is often raised that WHO did not say about public health emergency or pandemic when to declare. The key thing is that WHO mechanisms are agreed and decided under international health regulation, which was 1969 and then year 2005. These decisions are usually made by technical experts, and there is an emergency committee which met on 22nd January and then 29 January. So that committee is comprised of a global expert, and there is a number might be something around 30 or odd. And they advise, they deliberate various aspects and they advise. And WHO usually follows and goes by those advices received by the experts, and that helps in deciding the next course of action. Yes, there has been some criticism on various aspects, but it has been from the official spokesperson of WHO has often been said that this is an ongoing learning, the evidence which were available, and WHO does not have much of the legal authority on the member state. It is the member state information which is provided to WHO and WHO put on the website. For example, some countries have criticized that the information available on WHO websites is different or whatever loopholes are there. But we also need to understand that WHO does not have its own separate data. Whatever member state would decide to report to WHO, WHO cannot go beyond that, and we can use that much information. So it's WHO is a face of a global fight to the pandemic. The much of the criticism is sometimes, I would say, is political, but at the same time, some could be based upon different facts and understanding of the situation. So I'm not defending; these are my personal opinion. But at times, in short, a pandemic is a real global challenge. This is a novel virus. Every country is learning from different stages. And in that process, if on the basis of today's knowledge, if we start criticizing a 3 months old step, probably all of us, we can be criticized for one or other things. Thank
you. Professor Siddharth wants to make some observation on Mallika's comment. Professor?
Okay, yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think Mallika made some very important remarks about 3 or 4, I think, important dimensions relating to multilateralism and the role of international organizations. I would just sort of, 2 or 3 points. One, I think the recognition that we are operating in a really imperfect world. And the question to ask is, would we be better off without these existing multilateral arrangements, or are we better off without them at all? I think with them or without them. I think that's one question as a thought experiment you need to ask yourself in a whole range of these domains. So again, think about the World Health Organization, think about the other international organizations we have, and they do have their failings, they do have their inadequacies, but they've also contributed, I would think, in some important areas. And like I said earlier, it's far from perfect. There are imperfections. So I think the other point relates to bureaucratic cultures within these international organizations. And the point you make about, working in silos and the silo culture, where it doesn't necessarily involve a degree of coordination that is desirable. I think that is an important point relating to institutional design of these international organizations. And given the current state of the requirement or the current imperatives for some degree of coordination, sometimes across issue areas, there is need clearly for institutional design to be revisited in a manner which allows for this possibility to move around a little more seamlessly than is currently the case. But here again, there are bureaucratic path dependencies, there are earlier histories, which don't make it very easy sometimes to effect change within these cultures in international organizations. And a final point I'll make relating to, I think, the point you made about about people and where are people in this narrative, and again here, I think when I did briefly mention that, for instance, today there is clearer recognition of, for instance, NGOs and their participation within these international fora. There to a certain extent, maybe some of the views voiced by communities of people affected by certain things come to the fore. Quite clearly, there is now increasing evidence of a degree of coordination internationally around many of these questions, and through, I think, new social media cuts both ways, but quite clearly when it came to, for instance, the question of landmine bans or the Landmine Ban Convention or other issues, there has been a certain degree of coordination around these questions, often involving varieties of groups within broader civil societies as well, So I would think that, even the recognition, for instance, today of public diplomacy, even within our foreign policy establishments, is an acknowledgement of the importance of engaging these publics. I think with regard to international organizations and how they engage these publics, I think there is still a lot more which can be potentially done, but the manner in which even publics are engaged is a question which clearly is on the radar when it comes to thinking about ways in which we can think about solutions as well to these global problems. Thank you.
I would like to ask some question. Professor Chaturvedi could respond if you would like, sir. I will read out the question. So what do you expect a new normal to be like? And given the positive environmental impact of the worldwide lockdown, will multilateralism be able to ensure that people live in harmony with nature?
Thank you very much for this question. I think my response would be that let us pluralize. Let us pluralize both multilateralism, the notion of multilateralism, and also the notion of no. I think as and when normal takes place, it will look very different from different locations. It will look very differently to major powers. Now I'm talking about hierarchy in international relations, because we see that multilateralism has often been approached from the standpoint of the problem of anarchy in international relations, to fill in the gap for the absence of some kind of a global governance. But the question of hierarchy and agency has not received the kind of attention that it deserves. Within institutions, within the institutional cultures, within the institutional bureaucracies that we see operational in a particular site of multilateralism, the need for what Professor Siddharth said earlier, the democratization becomes very, very, very important. Who are the agenda setters? Who are the agenda takers? Who are the theory makers? Who are the theory takers? This whole politics of knowledge production. What role should the social scientists be playing along with the natural scientists when it comes to the question of addressing the challenge of the pandemics, for example? Now, I have a feeling that I think it was pointed out earlier as well that we haven't learned the lessons. I think the lesson part is sadly missing. We are looking at the COVID-19 as a moment of rupture, it's a moment of sudden departure. The same thing happened to climate change. I remember at one particular point, we felt that probably that is the only gorilla in the cupboard, without understanding that there are so many other problem areas, there are so many other issue areas, and we have to connect the dots. Now, the way in which human species have treated nature, the manner in which nature has been transformed into a controlled category called environment, the way in which narratives of sustainability and sustainable development have developed, and how the notion of sustainability has also been hijacked by certain agencies and agendas. I think the writing is very clear on the wall that if we do not respect nature, then we do not have even a right to turn nature into some kind of an enemy. Let us not try to create let us not use COVID-19 as some kind of a new map-making exercise, where we again partition the globe into safe zones, unsafe zones, geopolitical epicenters, and so on. Let us go for what some scholars have called for an appeal in international relations, which includes Professor Simon Dolby, who has written a lot on geopolitics of environment and climate change. A new planetary politics. I think this is the moment to have an intellectual, academic, epistemic movement in that direction. If we have not learned the lessons so far, and if we continue to refuse to learn the lessons and look at nature as if it exists outside the human world, and don't take a holistic, integrated view of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, as I said earlier, I think we are likely to better than learn to live with not only one risk, with multiple risks. Let us not forget that the way in which climate change is going to impact the health sector, the water sector, the agriculture, the livelihood aspects, we are not looking at an isolated issue area. We are looking at the whole cobweb of critically important issues which require a paradigm shift. If paradigm shift does not happen now, and the final point is, as I said, keeping the scale open and democratic. This is not to suggest that global scale is not important, but remember that once a scale is privileged, it leads to certain ethical and geopolitical implications. I think multilateralism, if supply chains can be internalized, even the spirit of an open, democratic, dialogic politics driven multilateralism can also be internalized in case of India in the form of cooperative federalism. So I think it is the democratic spirit, it is the respect for autonomy that is going to hold the key to the future. And this is where I think India can and should make a contribution, that we showing full respect to our natural habitat and realizing that now we have reached a moment in Anthropocene where we cannot simply take human health as an isolated issue or even individual health as an isolated issue and not looking at it in harmony with nature. So therefore, that was the reason, I was trying to make an appeal, for example, in support of paying enough attention to what I call subliminal multilateralism. We have high seas to be governed. We have Antarctica, 80% of fresh water to be governed. Most of the countries are Antarctica Treaty members. Governance is getting derailed. And let us not forget that COVID can also be transmitted from humans to Antarctica seals, for example. This is what I'm told by the scientists. So I think these are some of the lessons that we will have to learn. Thank you. I hope I have replied to your question to some extent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. I'll take one last question. Madam Lalita Kumaramangalam, if you want to respond to this question. This is from Mr. Ashwini Gupta, who's a retired banker. So I'll read out his question. I would particularly like to know the role played by business chambers and NGOs in promoting international cooperation and multilateralism, and how it can further be strengthened during and after the COVID crisis.
Can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you properly, Stanley. Your voice is breaking. Sorry.
I would particularly like to know the role played by business chambers and NGOs in promoting international cooperation and multilateralism, and how it can further be strengthened during this time of crisis.
Okay. First, let me say that there definitely is a role to be played by both these sectors, but the roles to be played are probably in many ways different. However, there has to also be cooperation between both the business sector and NGOs, not just in terms of business support, financial support for the activism that is currently, undertaken by many NGOs or what we call non-state actors, even all over the world. Now, from the business sector, obviously, there is going to be, as all the speakers have mentioned today, there's going to be far greater emphasis on health. And I agree with Professor Chaturvedi when he said that health and environment are going to be very closely intertwined in the future. And as you know, most of the environment work, or most of what has been achieved in terms of becoming friendlier or more sustainable, whether it's SDGs, whether it is just in promoting more sustainable or environment-friendly industry or trade and commerce, has been done with the urging or with the active sort of activism that our NGOs and civil society organizations have taken forward all over the world. I think that also there needs to be a recognition that each country comes from a different economic perspective. We are at different economic positions at the moment all over the world. No two countries are equal. And this also needs to be taken into consideration, which is where activism and organizations like FICCI need to sit down and have much more conversation, much more negotiation, much more mutual understanding. Till today, multilateralism has been based more on economics, on the economics of life. But unless we bring in the human perspective, unless we bring in the needs of human beings, we are not going to be, and not just human beings, all living beings on this planet. We are not going to be able to even sustain any sort of multilateralism. I said this earlier, that it's not just money that anymore can make the world go round. It has to be a marriage between the various issues that are today the most important in the world, which means that, yes, of course, business, but also health, and also the other needs of living beings on this planet. We have to coexist, in short. To put it very bluntly and put it in non-political terms, we have to learn to coexist. Human beings are at the top of the food chain. We are the ones who have to make the maximum effort. The seas are denuded, too much, there's too much cross not pollination, but there's too much controversy or perhaps animosity between human beings and other living animals on this planet, whether it is in terms of consumption of meat of various animals, whether it is in terms of absolutely denuding forest areas. And this recent story of the poor elephants in Kerala, it's not happening just in Kerala, it's happening all over the country. Leopards in various parts of this country and all over the world. I'm only talking about India. This is happening everywhere. Overfishing is an old story which for years many people have been trying to fight against. And Professor Chaturvedi said this very clearly. Unless we learn to coexist, and this is a reality that we have to accept. If we don't, countries, there's no point in talking about multilateralism, quite frankly. I know it sounds politically very, very strong, but the only way the world can go forward now is together, which means everybody, every living thing together, and with due respect to the environment. And yes, all organizations, whether they are state, whether they are governments, that is the state, whether they are non-state players like activists, NGOs, CBOs, etc., whether they are business organizations like FICCI and many others like this all over the world, whether they are organizations like the WTO or the WHO or BIMSTEC or any of them, any number of names. Everybody has to learn to coexist. Everybody has to learn to work together, and everybody has their own role to play. I hope that answers it satisfactorily.
Discussion today, which touched upon different areas of multilateralism, as most of you speakers agreed. A pivotal moment in history, because pandemics in the history, if you look back, pandemics had influenced human history in a greater way. In a sense, the Justinian plague had contributed to the weakening of the Byzantine Empire. The Black Death had, triggered social upheavals in Europe. And then we see the Spanish flu, according to many historians, was one of the factors for Germany's defeat in the First World War. So the pandemics had microbes, as somebody put it, microbes were writing history. So we are watching another pandemic, a once in a century phenomenon now, and it is a major crisis. It is a deep crisis which humanity is facing, and also, as all of you agreed, it is also an opportunity for the humankind to understand where we were or to prepare ourselves for a better future. And if you look at the global politics, this is also impacting geopolitics in a massive way, which we haven't seen in our lifetime, because the big powers, the so-called superpowers, are the pandemics, and which is also opening opportunities for multilateralism, multilateral institutions, global cooperation, the middle powers to rise, and it offers opportunity for countries like India. And India, as all of you agreed, is here to play a central role in the emerging new world order. And thank you very much once again, Professor Amitabh Mattu, Professor Siddharth Malvarepu, Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi, Dr. Chandrakantal Haria. Thank you very much for joining this discussion.
Thank you all once again.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.